John McDonnell has just announced this plan to give workers in companies of 250 people or more a stake in an equity stake in their company. So how radical do you think this plan is?
Well, let's just think about how it works. Companies pay their workers wages, but they also pay their owners dividends every year. That's a share of the profit. Not all the profit, some of the profit. Now, what McDonnell is saying is that the government would force all companies, public or private, to put aside a bit of their profits every year and in a fund out of which workers are paid cash. Now, dividends in the form of cash. So that's quite a big thing because it could be up to £500 a year. He's capped it at £500 a year. Now, on top of that, there's also another bit, i.e. if you reach £500 per worker per year, what happens to the rest of the fund? Well, the government could take some of that and use it for things like public investment, for rebuilding railways or more nurseries. So what we're seeing here is redistribution, but of a different kind. Usually we take tax and then we spend it on the health service or education. Here is redistribution happening within the corporate sector, within business. And, quite a lot of, people in their kind of ruling elite have been saying since 2008, we need a new kind of capitalism. Well, that's it.
One aspect of this is potentially really radical is the fact that it's undermining this distinction between labour and capital, between workers and owners. Can you talk a little bit more about the philosophy that underlies that?
Well, let's think about this. In the era of free market economics, since Thatcher, we call it neoliberalism, we've seen this marked decline in the share of social wealth that is earned through wages. So, workers' wages not only stagnate, the actual amount of money flowing to the working class through wages has fallen quite dramatically across the Western world. And while we try to boost the wage share, as we call it, through empowering workers in the workplace, that can take a long time. So this measure simply says, the bit that's flowing to capital in the form of profits, that too can be redirected towards the poor, the working class, the employee, in the form of a share dividend. And many liberal parties and even conservative parties have toyed with the idea of, let's have employee share ownership, but it never happens. And when it does happen, often it's in the most retrograde form. And this means that if your company does well, you do well, which is so often not the case. Think about Amazon. Think about, some of the big exploitative firms. When Amazon does well, the Amazon employee doesn't necessarily do well at all, but this would force Amazon to start paying its employees out of the proceeds of growth and prosperity, which hopefully is what we want.
And so you mentioned that this has kind of been tried before, and various different parties have mentioned it's important to give workers a stake in the way their company runs. But presumably a big part of the reason this hasn't happened is because it's really striking at the heart of the capitalist system. So what kind of resistance would you expect?
Well, I don't think this does strike at the heart of the capitalist system. It strikes at the heart of a principle within neoliberalism of that as growth occurs, that as profits are generated, only the rich, only the elite gets distributionally the proceeds of that success. That was never true in the era I grew up in, which is, it's one lifetime in the 1960s and 70s. All kinds of mechanisms were used within society to divert and redistribute wealth towards workers. But it was mainly the wage relationship between, the worker and the boss, or through providing public services. Until and unless, and many people say, we don't want to go back to the 1970s, the bad old days of nationalisation and state intervention. Well, to the extent that they don't want to, and we can't roll the clock back, we need to be able to use the relationship between the worker and the employer as owners rather than simply wage earners to cascade some wealth over to them. So I really don't think it is a radical move in that sense. But what is the radicalism that it embodies? It is John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn and the radical left Labour Party that we have created with our 500,000 members saying to Britain's bosses, look, we want to find a new partnership with you, because to the extent that, suppose it's Amazon or suppose it's BMW that are giving workers 500 quid a year in cash out of the profits, then they have a shared interest in making those firms profitable. After all, from the TUC, in other words, right through to the bad old red flag waving Corbynistas, we want partnership, because we know that proper partnership breeds success, and it breeds respect, and it breeds social justice at a qualitative level, not just measured in pounds and pennies.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what I'm getting from that is that this isn't necessarily, striking at the heart of capitalism per se, but at this particular model of capitalism within which the idea of maximising shareholder value has, since the 1980s, been a very central feature. And this isn't necessarily getting away from that logic. It's not saying, we need to stop companies being profitable or stop money going to shareholders. It's just saying that those profits need to be distributed far more widely. So what we're really looking at is moving away from financial capitalism, from neoliberalism, towards something different.
Exactly, and also there's a power relationship as well, because although the workers will not hold their shares individually like you do in a pension fund. Remember, so few people now have pension funds, but the workers won't own the shares, still less they will be trading them with other companies. But the way it will work in terms of the power balance is that, as far as I understand it, what Labour wants is for workers to have up to a third of board members as well. Now, 10% of shares and a third of board members gives you a lot of say. And it means that even though if those 1/3 of workers can always be outvoted by 2/3 of shareholders and sort of, grandees in their pinstripe suits, they will know about stuff. So if there's a spate of redundancies or a takeover or workplace reorganization coming, what workers need to know is they have an equal right to know about these things at phase one as the bosses do. And that principle will be established by these proposals. And I think it's something that most far-sighted and progressive employers know they can live with. Why? Because in other countries, like the Nordic countries, they have to live with it. It's just here. We've created a system where we disempower the workforce, and I think that the combination of employee share ownership and employees on the board will really empower workers in a way that Labour people argue that this is virtuous for capitalism, because if you say, if you can make profits simply by cutting wages, exploiting people, and like shit conditions and low rent type businesses, the classic, kind of cleaning firm, the security firm, the hyper exploitative construction firm, then you're never going to innovate. You come out of university and you meet these people. I'm going to be a business person. What business are you going to set up? Low rent coffee shop. Well, what about setting up a gene editing lab? Or, well, that's too hard. I can make just as much money from exploiting people on £7 an hour. Well, no, you won't be able to. And so the entire principle of economic policy, which is not unique to Labour, is about crowding out bad behaviour and crowding in constructive and productive and socially responsible behaviour.
And what would you say to those who would argue in response to this that because you are going to be seeing some of the profits from private enterprise accruing to workers rather than shareholders, this will have a negative impact on investment? So people might say, I don't want to do my gene editing pool because I'm going to have to give a little bit of my equity to my shareholders.
What I would say to all these people who object to the most basic, kind of redistributary measures, fuck you, I would say. because, sorry, why do you think people are so angry? Why do you think we've got people, Tommy Robinson and his supporters, marauding down Whitehall? Why do you think we've got 10,000 people on the streets of Chemnitz in Germany, giving Nazi salutes? Because they don't like the world as it is. And if you, the people in the boardrooms and the people in the shareholding forums, can't get on board with the most basic kind of progressive reform to capitalism, what you're going to get is the capitalism of the 1930s. Highly authoritarian, conservative, dysfunctional, and ultimately, racist. Because this thing that you've created, the neoliberal system, it's falling apart. So, what I want to basically say to people, the actual measure itself is not that radical. That if they choose to make it radical, they're just digging the grave of the whole liberal system.
Paul, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
And thank you for watching. Please go to support.novaramedia.com and subscribe. I think we're currently asking people to give the equivalent of 1 hour of their wage each month as part of our sub-raiser. So thanks very much for joining me, and thanks very much, Paul.
1 hour's labour power.
Exactly.
Yeah. Abstract in general.